Dogworks Radio is sponsored by Alaska Dogworks. Check out their website at alaskadogworks.com.
Start your day tomorrow with The Daily Dog with Michelle Forto, the morning podcast on Dogworks Radio. Apple Podcast reviewer Patty Christensen calls it funny, smart, and filled with all the info I want to know about dogs. I love this show. Wake up with The Daily Dog. Available on Dogworks Radio on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your shows.
Radio Free Palmer 89.5 KVRF presents Mushing Radio, hosted by Robert Forto. Mushing Radio is about dog-powered sports, living in the Great White North, and mushing. Visit our website at mushingradio.com. Here is your host, Robert Forto.
Hello and welcome, everybody. This is Robert Forto, and you're listening to Mushing Radio here on KVRF 89.7 in the Mat-Su Valley. RadioFreePalmer.org is their live streaming site, and you can find all of our episodes over on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. You can also find us over on dogworksradio.com. And joining us from Southern California is our co-host. His name is Alex Stein. Alex, how's it going?
It's going great, Robert. Very, very excited to be back on with you.
Yes.
Especially now that the racing season is underway.
Yes, we have not had a normal show, in quotes, for a while. We've been busy doing our limited edition series, the Serum Run, so it is great to have you back on the air with us. Yeah, and
meanwhile, while we've been doing that, you have been airing a bunch of really wonderful interviews with mushers, so it's been exciting to hear those as well.
Right. So today, guys, I would like to talk about a couple of things. It is in the middle of racing season up here in Alaska. Typically, mushing season is only just a couple or 2.5 months long up here. Usually starts the first weekend of January and ends with the Quest at about mid-February. Then we head right into Iditarod there, and that lasts into in the middle of March. But our qualifying or mid-distance season is really only about a month and a half or so. And we've had some races already happen, the first one being the Connect 200, which was last weekend, and just starting this weekend, and it is January 13th when we're recording this, is the Copper Basin 300. Alex, did you get a chance to follow the Connect 200 at all?
Just a little bit, not as much as I would have liked.
You know, it was a very fast race. Nick Pettit won in almost record-breaking time. And, you know, you and I have talked about Nick for the last few years. That guy is a speed demon, isn't he?
He really is. And he's the sort of musher who seems to just put his nose to the grindstone and, just settle in and go. He's not the sort of person who generally gets tied up in a lot of controversy, but is just, I think, a really well-respected and well-liked musher.
Oh, I agree. And you know what's really interesting is the second-place finisher, Brenda Mackey. She has been on the show not too long ago. In the last couple of months or so, she was on Mushing Radio with us, and she finished in second place, so did very good. Do you know much about Brenda?
Just a very little bit, but she is certainly someone that people should be, and not just because of her last name, but people should be on the lookout for her to do really good things in the next few years, I think.
You know, I agree with you, and I've gotten to know Brenda a little bit over the last couple of years. I have 3 of her dogs in our dog yard now, 3 up-and-coming leaders, Poker, Honcho, and Chief. So we're looking forward to training those guys up and doing very well. So I look forward to seeing Brenda and her husband Will doing very well in the coming years. And what we're looking at in terms of finishing is we have Nick Pettit, Brenda Mackey, Dave Turner, Ray Reddington, and Lance Mackey. What do you think about Lance coming in 5th place there and coming in strong? You know, he said he was going to be out of mushing for a little while.
Yeah, Lance is the type of guy who I don't think he will ever totally be completely out of mushing. And he's made statements in the past that he's not going to run Iditarod anymore, that he's going to keep himself to sprint races, he said at one point, or that he's going to do mid-distance races only. And I certainly have a great deal of affection for Lance, as I think a lot of us do. And even if he can't be doing the long-distance races, it's so wonderful to see him doing the mid-distance races. And, in the back of my head, I keep thinking, well, maybe he just needs a year or two to get really healthy and then could come back strong in Iditarod.
Right. So now let's talk a little bit about the Copper Basin 300. It is the first 300-mile race up here in Alaska of the season, and it's known as a true test for those folks that are going to be doing Iditarod in the coming months. It's supposed to be set up very similar to how the Iditarod is run in terms of trail conditions and elevation and, sort of the way it works in how that race is happening. And there's currently 43 people 43 mushers on the trail. They just started a couple of hours ago, and we have the who's who of mushing. We have Allie and Alan from SP Kennels. We have Rob Cook. We have Paige Dromby. We have Sven Haltman, Ed Hopkins, Dan Caduce. Let's see who else. JJ Levy. I know that you've spoken about her several times here on the show. Ryan Olson, Tim Pappas, Nick Pettit, Michelle Phillips, Robert Reddington, and the list goes on and on. So, yeah, we have a really interesting field in that race as well, don't we? Yeah,
and the Copper Basin is kind of well known to be a very, very challenging race, a race that is certainly, not that any dog race is a walk in the park, but it's a lot more challenging than a lot of mid-distance races. And many people feel that doing well and being able to handle the challenges of the Copper Basin is something that bodes really well for when people are going into Iditarod, especially going into their first Iditarods.
Right. Next week, we were supposed to have the Northern Lights 300 right here in the valley. Typically, it starts over at Martin Booser's kennel there at the Happy Trails kennel in Big Lake, and then finishes up, and they alternate depending on the year, whether it's in Big Lake or in Willow. But that race was canceled, and it's canceled for a very interesting reason. According to their Facebook page, they were canceled for lack of entries, and I find that really interesting. What are your thoughts on that, Alex?
Well, we've talked in the past a lot about how it's been typically very difficult to get into these qualifying races, and a lot of them do entries online now, so people are sitting at their computers at the exact time it opens up and refreshing their browsers over and over again trying to get in. And it's not been uncommon in the past few years for these races to fill up almost immediately. And then there are waiting lists for people to get into the race. So for a well-established qualifier like this to not have enough entries is very odd, and I think it speaks to what you and I have talked about a lot, which is the economic conditions in Alaska. I think a lot of folks are feeling the squeeze economically in a way that they hadn't up until the past couple of years. Alaska generally is on a bit of a lag economically, so there will be overall conditions in most of the country, and it will take a little while for that to really take effect in Alaska. So I'm wondering if that's what's going on, that people were looking at the race calendar and saying, I can't afford to do all of the qualifiers I want, so I'm going to pick and choose which ones. That I could be wrong, but that's my theory of it.
I agree with you there. I think a lot of it has to do with the economy up here. Living here, I see it, sort of personally on how things are happening up here. But what's also interesting about the Northern Lights is they typically, at least for the last few years, have not offered a purse. And a lot of folks have a hard justification putting together, a 300-mile race team and getting all prepared for that, and all the expenses that come with travel and food drops and all of that, to enter into a race that is, not only a 300-mile qualifier, but a race that's on the road system, which there aren't too many of them around. It's tough to enter a race where, even if you're, in the middle of the pack and have typically at least gotten your entry fee back, it's tough to enter a race where you're pretty much racing for nothing.
Right. And, which is not to say that everyone is going to win or is going to get a substantial amount of money for it. But as you said, just being able to get something back, or to get your entry fee back, even if you don't cover all of your expenses for the race, that's something that helps. And, we've talked a lot about the economics of running a competitive dog team. And, it's a 300-mile race instead of a 1,000-mile race, so there aren't as many food drops and they don't go as far. But still, doing food drops for a full competitive dog team, even for a 300-mile race, is not a small thing.
Right. For a 200 or a 300-mile race, our food drops typically cost between $1,000 and $1,500 to $2,000 just for that race, because you're buying booties and food and meat and snacks and all of this extra stuff along with the travel to get there. And if you have a handler, you have to put them up in a hotel while you're racing, et cetera, et cetera. So it is quite expensive just to race for one weekend, even though it is on the road system. It's still not something where, it's not like a 5K that you do, in town where you pay your $50 entry fee, you run your 5K and it's over. This is an entirely different ballgame.
Yeah, and, this is just the specific cost to the race. And, there's the entry fee, and there's all of the items that you mentioned, and then there's sometimes additional veterinary fees and things like that. And before you know it, you're talking a pretty good outlay of money, just for that one weekend.
I agree with you there. And, there's also been talk about the reason for cancellation is a relatively new race has started up, the Willow 300. It is the following weekend, so it is 2 weekends from today. Remember, we're hosting this today on January 13th, and that race does have a purse. I don't know the exact number of the purse this year, but it is a very well put together race. I know Wade Mars and his wife, Sophia, are on the board there, and they have a lot of volunteer support. It does start right here in Willow, just in the same spot where the Iditarod restart starts, and it follows a lot of that same trail as the first legs of Iditarod, and that has been a very successful race in the last couple of years. Do you know much about that race at all, Alex?
I haven't followed that race closely, but it seems, and maybe this would be a good topic for a future show, that there are a lot of different things that go into determining whether a relatively new race becomes successful. And it seems that one of the big things that goes into just determining how people view the race is who's involved with it. So meaning which well-known mushers or which respected mushers are involved either in the field, in the competitive field, or behind the scenes. And I think that, having someone who is very well respected like Wade Mars is a big, thing in favor of a race.
Again, I agree with you. And going back to the Connect 200, Didi Genre was the race marshal for that race last weekend. So that what you said is exactly right. When you have somebody of that caliber making sure that a race is done correctly and done well, I think that plays into a big part on how successful a race is. But I agree with you. I think that's a great topic for another show. And folks, I want to make sure that we cover the topic that we really want to dive into today, is the Iditarod doping saga is still continuing. I know that was first made to light in October. Here we are in mid-January, and this is not something that's going to die down, is it, Alex?
No, I in some ways I wish that it would. In other ways, I think that even though I don't like all of the things that are going on with this ongoing scandal, I think it is going to, when it all shakes out, result in something that is much better for the race and for the mushers. But it is amazing to me that we're sitting here in the middle of January, and this is still a topic that is, every bit as hot as it was a few months ago.
What I find really interesting is sort of the way that it's popped up in the news. I know just this week, Dallas CV made the rounds on all of the local news stations and newspaper websites and that sort of thing, and released quite a few interviews regarding that. And he sounds very determined to make sure that the Iditarod pays for its mistakes. What are your thoughts on the media coverage of Dallas in the last few days or so?
It's I have very mixed feelings about the entire deal. Dallas CV has hired a very well-known crisis management PR firm who have been advising him since, I believe, October or November. And then recently he's put out a demand that the Iditarod prove that he is responsible for the doping of his dogs, which is, unless the Iditarod has surveillance footage of someone, of Dallas, actually administering drugs to his dogs, which I am positive they do not have, that's an impossible thing to prove. So he's really asking them for something that he knows that they can't give him. And that's a way of being much more aggressive with them in a public relations stance. There has been a lot of argument back and forth, and Dallas supporters are adamantly on his side, and then there are other people who are very opposed to the ITC and the way that they've handled this. And it seems like there's not a lot of middle ground at the moment. And what I'm afraid is getting lost is what is the best for the sport and what is the best for Iditarod going forward.
Right. What I found real interesting is his camp, Dallas's camp, is pretty much saying that they need to prove that it was done, or, sort of prove the positive. And, I know we've talked about this on the show, and just about every other sport, the onus lies on the person that is found to be guilty or at least suspected of doping, whether it be bike racing or other sled dog sports or, track and field or whatever. It's typically on the athlete to prove that there was no malfeasance or malintent. But now all of a sudden the athlete is turning the tables and saying, nope, you need to prove that we did something wrong. What are your thoughts about that?
It's interesting because Dallas has announced that he is not going to run Iditarod this year, but instead is running the Finn Market Slope, which hopefully I've pronounced that somewhat close to the way it's properly pronounced, which is a race overseas, I think in Norway. And that race has exactly the same type of doping rules, anti-doping rules, that Dallas is now saying are completely unacceptable in Iditarod. So it's strange to me that he's moving away from Iditarod and saying, I'm never coming back until changes are made. And he's called for ousting board members who were responsible for this decision. And yet he's turning right around and going into a race that has exactly the same kind of rules. So I'm not really sure what to make of that. I don't want to cast aspersions about Dallas, but I will say this: he is someone who, because of his involvement with reality TV, I think he's someone who is much more media savvy than a lot of mushers, and I think that he really knows how to play the media game and how to sort of manipulate the way information is presented to the audience and to the fans.
My next point, Alex, that I would like to talk about is if we go way back to October on how this originally was handled. It was, to backtrack a little bit, the drug test was found and it was positive, and the Iditarod was pretty much going to keep it hush-hush. They didn't release the name. They talked to the musher, who, of course, ended up being Dallas, and things sort of laid down pretty low until the media got involved, and then, of course, the uproar started. And it was not until the Iditarod Finishers Club, which is a group of mushers that have completed the Iditarod, sort of the de facto union for Iditarod mushers, until they really put the heat on, a name was not released to the public. And if I remember correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, Alex, that it was only within an hour or so after Iditarod or the media released the name that was when Dallas released that YouTube video. So what do you think about that? It seems to me like they were just going to let things lay low. They said, okay, well, you've been found positive. We're not going to do anything about it. We're just going to let this sort of slide and change policy, but we're not going to do anything to you in terms of disqualification or losing of time or money or anything like that. And then all of a sudden, it's sort of one of those chess matches where, one hand moved one way and the other hand moved the other. And then that started the uproar. What are your thoughts about how it was originally handled, sort of on the down low? And then, of course, it worked the way it is today.
I think this is kind of emblematic of the way the ITC has operated for a long time. And people have accused the ITC of being overly clubby and insular and, protecting their own. And I think there probably is an element of that. But on the other hand, it's a relatively small, or has been a relatively small community that is really, that they're really dealing with. So it may have been acceptable, and it may have been, the prudent way to do things, to handle things that way 20 years ago or 30 years ago. And maybe now that there's more light being cast on this, there's a need for more transparency in it. I wanted to mention that our friend Craig Medred has a really interesting article that came out a couple days ago as we're recording this, where he was talking about how one of the things the Iditarod has said, or the ITC has said, is this is the first positive drug test that has ever come up. And Craig said that when he was first covering the Iditarod, there were other positive drug tests, or there was other evidence of doping in Iditarod dogs, but it was swept under the rug. So is it possible that this has been going on for a long time? Yes. Is it? I think that the ITC is perhaps getting stuck with, this is the way they've always handled it, and it's worked in the past, so they assume it would work now, and maybe there's a need for some more transparency. But I do come back to the fact that Dallas I don't know that Dallas really has, before his name came out, which was partially at his insistence and partially at his lobbying for it to come out, I don't know that Dallas really had suffered a lot of harm from any of this, because he wasn't disqualified from the race. He wasn't penalized monetarily in any way. There are some reports that he was already planning to run this other race in 2018 and take a year off from Iditarod. So it's not entirely clear to me what harm happened to Dallas, and if he had chosen to stay quiet, I'm not sure that his name would have come out, or certainly it wouldn't have come out as quickly as it came out.
I agree with you there as well. And, my last point to this, and hopefully we got time just to get your take on it, is after all of this, the Iditarod said that they were going to make changes. They were going to do changes with security and checkpoints and that sort of thing, and also have changes in regards to the drug doping rule, meaning that they do have to prove their own innocence and that sort of thing. What are your take on the changes as we set forward here mid-January?
I think it's a good step in the right direction, and I think having more light shined on it and having more light shined on what their practices are so that we can see if they line up with what's being done in other sports. And, as we've discussed many times, the Iditarod is both similar to and very, very different than other sports. I'm not sure of any other sport where there's 1,000 miles of essentially track that has to be looked after or policed. So I think it's going to take years for this to really sort out in a way that's satisfactory to all of the, to the mushers and to the ITC and to the fans. But they clearly have to start this process, and they have to start doing things to get themselves back on track. So at the moment, I am inclined to give them the benefit of the doubt. But I also think that there were some things that were handled maybe not as carefully as they might have been in other sports, and finding a way to refine those procedures so that everything will stand up to scrutiny and will stand up to transparency is a very good thing.
There you have it, guys. This is a story that we will continue to follow as the season progresses. I'm sure that it's not going to die down anytime soon, and I'm sure it will be a topic of discussion when we do our nightly coverage on Iditarod like we've done for the last few years. Alex, thank you very much for joining us today, and we'll talk again soon, okay? Okay.
Thanks, Robert.
Thank you. On behalf of my co-host, Alex Stein, this is Robert Forto for Mushing Radio here on KVRF 89.7 in the Mat-Su Valley. We will talk to you guys next time.
Did you know that Alaska Dog Works trains service dogs for those in need throughout North America? Each and every service dog that is trained through the Lead Dog Service Dog Program and Michelle Forto and her team has an individual training plan. We train for autistic, mobility, psychiatric, and PTSD for our soldiers for service work. If you know of someone that may need a service dog, please take a moment and check out Alaska Dog Works on social media and at alaskadogworks.com.
Hi guys, it's Alex. If you're a fan of sled dog sports and the Iditarod, Mushing Radio is the show for you. Each Wednesday we drop a new episode on Dogworks Radio, so be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from.
If you like our podcast, there are a few things you can do. You can take a couple of minutes and go to Apple Podcasts and leave us a 5-star review. You can also check out all of our Dogworks Radio sponsors and promotions in our show notes. Another thing you can do is go over to Facebook, like our Facebook page, and one last thing, please tell all of your friends by spreading the word about Dogworks Radio. Thank you so much for listening to us. We really appreciate you.
Dogworks Radio is produced by Robert Forto. Logo art by Angry Squirrel Studios. Dogworks Radio is produced in conjunction with KVRF 89.7 in Palmer, Alaska.
For dog training advice, you can contact Alaska Dogworks at 907-841-1686 or visit their website at alaskadogworks.com. If you have a show idea or would like to be a guest, please contact us by sending an email to live@dogworksradio.com.